I want you to imagine that you are standing in this really large, kind of dark industrial basement,
Okay.
and you're staring at this massive cast iron boiler,
Right.
and the pressure dial on this thing is just, it's creeping right into the red zone. The metal is physically groaning.
Sounds terrifying.
Yeah, exactly.
You're like,
And you know intuitively that if this pressure isn't released,
yeah.
the whole system is just going to completely explode.
Right. Right.
But instead of, shutting down the machine and actually replacing the faulty valve, someone just walks over, slaps a piece of duct tape over a crack, and resets the dial to 0.
And the rumbling just stops.
Exactly. The basement is quiet again. But the core mechanics of that machine, they are still completely broken.
It's just a matter of time before the pressure builds right back up.
Right.
And I mean, that is such a remarkably accurate way to visualize human struggle, especially, when we look at trauma and behavior,
Yeah.
because we always want human psychology to be like a simple broken bone.
Right, like an x-ray shows a clean fracture, you put a cast on it, and you're good.
Exactly. And it heals. But human behavioral challenges, the ways we hurt each other and the ways we hurt ourselves, they operate much more like that complex failing boiler.
Wow, yeah.
The underlying pressure is invisible, at least until it causes a massive rupture.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to really explore the reality of how people struggle, how they develop these survival mechanisms, and ultimately how they heal.
And we have some incredible source material for this.
We do. We are pulling from some foundational counseling frameworks today. Specifically, we're looking at the realities of abuse, addiction, and persistent challenges, like living with disabilities.
Right.
And we are going to bypass all the heavy clinical jargon today. We really just want to figure out how these hidden mechanics actually work in the real world.
Because, whether you realize it or not, you are interacting with these invisible pressures every single day of your life.
Every day. And understanding those mechanisms really has to begin with looking at the external forces that put that pressure on the system in the first place, right?
Right, exactly. Before someone develops a destructive internal coping mechanism, there is almost always an external catalyst.
So we have to start by looking at interpersonal abuse.
You do.
Because, we tend to think of violence or abuse as these random, totally unpredictable explosions.
Yes.
But the foundational models show us that it's actually this terrifyingly predictable loop.
Yeah, it's known as the cycle of abuse.
Right. It's not random at all.
No, it operates like a very rigid piece of clockwork.
Yeah.
And that is exactly what makes it so incredibly difficult for a person to escape.
It's a trap.
It is. So the cycle generally runs in 3 distinct phases.
Okay.
First, you have the tension building phase. This is that pressure dial creeping into the red.
Like the boiler.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it could be triggered by, financial stress, work issues, or just internal emotional instability in the abuser.
So the environment just feels like you're constantly walking on eggshells.
Right. And then comes the second phase, which is the actual abusive event, the explosion.
But the third phase, that's the piece of duct tape on the boiler, isn't it?
It is. The apologies.
The apologies.
That third phase is the ultimate psychological trap. It's often called the honeymoon or the reconciliation phase.
What does that look like?
Well, the abuser makes amends, they buy gifts, or they make these grand promises that it will never, ever happen again.
Right.
And sometimes they even subtly shift the blame. They'll say things like, I'm sorry, but you know how stressed I get when you do that thing.
Oh, wow. So they make it the victim's fault, kind of.
Exactly. And these apologies, they act as a powerful negative reinforcement for the victim.
Because the terrifying tension is just suddenly gone.
Yes, it's replaced by affection. So the victim's brain is flooded with relief, and that creates a totally false sense of security.
And then the dial resets. The tension just starts building all over again.
Psych.
I really want to look at where this cycle actually starts for a lot of people. Because when we hear the word abuse, our minds immediately jump to, like, domestic partnerships
Right.
or child abuse by a parent. But a massive piece of this puzzle is actually sibling abuse.
Yeah, that's a huge blind spot for a lot of people.
It's huge. The data shows that up to 40% of children in the U.S. experience physical aggression from a sibling.
It's wild.
We were talking about hitting, kicking, or even using objects as weapons. It's pervasive.
It is arguably the most common form of family violence, and yet it just routinely flies completely under the radar.
Why is that?
Well, society has this tendency to view it through a very specific lens. We brush it off as, sibling rivalry or just kids' roughhouses.
Yeah, kids.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But from a behavioral standpoint, this isn't playful wrestling. It is an active competition for dominance and power within the family structure.
And the frameworks we're exploring today, they highlight how dangerous that misinterpretation actually is.
They really do.
Because I was thinking, if you are sitting at your desk at work and a coworker hits you with a heavy object.
Right, you'd call HR or the police.
Exactly. But if you were a child and your brother does it in the living room, you were often just told to work it out, or that it's just a phase.
And the real danger there is that these children are learning the exact mechanics of the cycle of abuse.
The tension, the violence, the minimization.
Right there in their formative environment. Those early environments build the actual neurological pathways for how we expect relationships to function.
So they carry it into adulthood.
They do. Individuals who experience severe sibling abuse have a statistically higher likelihood of ending up in adult relationships where they are either the victim or the perpetrator.
Because they've been conditioned to accept that love and violence can kind of just coexist in the same space.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the adults who are actually trapped in this cycle. The text gives us this case study of a woman named Charlene that I think perfectly illustrates how this looks in the real world.
Yeah, Charlene's story is really compelling.
So Charlene was this professional woman, totally functional at her job.
Mm-hmm.
To you or me or any of her coworkers, she just seemed to have this very specific, modest fashion sense.
Right.
She always wore long-sleeve blouses, these flowing skirts, and elegant scarves around her neck, even in the warmer summer months.
Because she was hiding it in plain sight.
She was. She was concealing the physical evidence of that second phase of the cycle.
The explosions.
Yeah. And it wasn't until her friend Madge noticed a scarf slip one afternoon that the whole illusion broke.
Right, Madge saw the bruise.
She saw this massive bruise on Charlene's neck, gently confronted her, and Charlene finally broke down and admitted that her spouse was physically abusing her.
And you know, a really crucial factor in cases like Charlene's is understanding what fuels the severity of those explosions.
Right.
The research shows a staggering statistic here. Violence accompanying intimate partner abuse is 19 times higher when a male partner is intoxicated.
19 times. That is astronomical.
It is. And to understand why that number is so high, we have to look at what alcohol actually does to the brain's architecture.
Okay.
So intoxication heavily suppresses the prefrontal cortex.
That's the part of the brain that handles like logic and planning.
Exactly. Executive function, impulse control, and evaluating the long-term consequences of your actions.
So that just goes completely offline.
It goes offline. And when it does, the primal emotional centers of the brain totally take over.
Wow.
Whatever thin layer of social conditioning was keeping that pressure valve in check, it just dissolves completely.
So the counselor's job in these scenarios is basically to act as the person who unplugs the machine.
Yes. They are trained to look for those really subtle signs, like a sudden, rigid change in wardrobe, like Charlene's, and to intervene.
Because a person like Charlene, whose whole reality has been so distorted by the constant whiplash of violence and apologies, they often just cannot break the cycle without external leverage.
They can't. They need an objective guide to show them that the machine is fundamentally broken. It doesn't just need another apology.
Right. But what happens when people endure this kind of external trauma or honestly, even just the crushing, unrelenting stress of modern life,
Yeah.
and they don't have a way to release the pressure?
Well, people need a coping mechanism.
Right.
And often they turn the abuse inward. They find a way to artificially control their own internal dials.
And we define that inward turn as intrapersonal abuse, which, most people simply call addiction.
Yes, addiction.
And to separate like a bad habit from a legitimate addiction, the sources give us this very clear diagnostic framework.
Well,
It's called the 3 C's.
right, the 3 C's. It really removes the guesswork.
Let's walk through them.
Sure. So the 3 C's help us understand that addiction isn't about moral failure at all. It's about a hijacking of the brain's reward system.
Okay.
The first C is loss of control.
Meaning they can't stop.
Exactly. The individual cannot predict how much of a substance they will use or when they will actually be able to stop.
Okay, that makes sense. And the second C.
The second C is compulsive use. And this isn't just a casual desire. It is this overpowering, totally intrusive urge.
So the brain becomes just preoccupied with acquiring and using the substance.
Yes. And the third C, which is often the most visible and really the most devastating, is continued use regardless of negative consequences.
Continued use even when it's destroying your life.
That is the defining hallmark of the pathology. The actual survival hierarchy in the brain has been entirely rewritten.
There's this powerful example of a man named Nicholas in the text that shows just how deeply that survival hierarchy gets rewritten.
Right, Nicholas.
Yeah, so Nicholas was a heavy smoker for 25 years. We're talking a pack a
A
day.
heavy habit,
Very heavy. And he ends up suffering a massive life-threatening heart attack.
directly caused by the smoking.
Exactly. So the doctors put him on strict bed rest in the hospital. He is quite literally recovering from an event that almost killed him. And yet, the physical grip is so overpowering that he actually begs his wife to leave the hospital, go to the store, and smuggle cigarettes back into his room.
It's a perfect example of that third C. The nicotine has altered the dopaminergic pathways in his brain so much that, to Nicholas's central nervous system, acquiring nicotine feels just as essential to his survival as acquiring water or oxygen.
Wow. So the logical knowledge that the cigarette caused the heart attack, it cannot override that primal demand of the withdrawal.
It can't.
But here is where it gets really interesting to me. Because when we picture addiction, we picture Nicholas.
We picture substances.
Right. We picture substances we ingest, nicotine, alcohol, narcotics. But the framework expands way beyond substances into something called process addictions.
And process addictions are fascinating because they demonstrate that you do not actually need an external chemical to hijack the brain's reward system.
Oh, really? So what is a process addiction then?
It's a compulsion to engage in a specific behavior, but the mechanism of action is almost identical to a substance addiction.
How does that work?
Well, just the anticipation of the behavior releases a massive spike of dopamine. The person loses control over the behavior and they continue despite ruinous consequences.
So compulsive gambling would be a prime example of that.
Exactly. The thrill of the bet creates a euphoric state that completely mirrors a chemical high.
Okay, but the process addiction that I think truly alters how you view daily life is workaholism.
Workaholism is a massive one.
How the sources define it.
It's characterized by an absolute inability to regulate work habits. The individual imposes these relentless demands on themselves.
So they just overindulge in productivity.
Yes, to the severe detriment of their physical health, their marriages, and their ability to function outside of an office environment.
See, this creates a fascinating social paradox for me.
How so?
Well, if a process addiction destroys a marriage and ruins a person's cardiovascular health, which are the exact same outcomes as a severe substance use disorder, right?
Right.
Society's reaction is drastically different. Like, we do not promote the person who passes out at their desk from alcohol.
Definitely not.
But we routinely applaud the person who works 80-hour weeks and misses every single family dinner. We call them dedicated, we give them raises.
It's true.
The environment actively rewards the pathology.
And that social reinforcement makes process addictions notoriously difficult for counselors to treat.
I bet, because the client is just receiving constant validation for their compulsive behavior from their bosses and their peers.
Exactly. So to treat workaholism, a counselor has to help the client completely rebuild their identity so it's no longer exclusively tied to their economic output.
What does that treatment even look like?
They actively prescribe things like diet, mandatory rest, and they actually force the client to engage in non-productive hobbies.
Oh, wow. They literally have to teach the person how to slow down and exist without producing something.
They do. And, we also really have to acknowledge that accessing this kind of treatment is not a uniform experience for everyone.
Right. The frameworks point out some pretty significant disparities in who gets help and how they are perceived.
Very significant. For minority groups and women, the barriers to entering addiction treatment are incredibly steep.
What kind of barriers?
Well, women, for example, often lack access to childcare facilities that would actually allow them to attend an inpatient rehab.
That makes it practically impossible.
Exactly. And furthermore, the social stigma is distributed so unevenly.
Yeah.
A mother struggling with an addiction faces a much harsher, more punitive societal judgment than a father in the exact same scenario.
Which just breeds intense shame, and I imagine that drives the addiction even further underground.
It does. It becomes just another layer of pressure in the boiler.
Right. So far, we've explored, external trauma that happens to people and the coping mechanisms they adopt to survive it.
Yes.
But there is another reality we really need to look at. Millions of people navigate the world every day with persistent physical, emotional, or neurodevelopmental conditions.
They aren't trying to recover from an event. They are just living with disabilities.
Exactly. So how do the counseling frameworks handle disability?
Well, how society and the counseling profession handle disability has undergone a really massive evolution over time.
Okay.
For a very long time, the dominant framework was known as the medical model of disability.
Let's look at how that model actually functions. Because the medical model views a disability essentially as a biological error, right?
Yes, it assumes the deficiency resides entirely within the individual.
It relies heavily on diagnostic language, like categorizing exactly what is broken physically or mentally.
And the implicit goal of this model is to cure or fix the person so they can somehow fit into standard society.
But the problem with the medical model is that it kind of reduces a human being to just a walking pathology.
It really does. It is an exhausting way to exist, constantly being evaluated for what you cannot do.
Right.
And this is exactly why modern approaches have shifted heavily toward what's called the minority model.
And the minority model flips the lens completely.
It does.
It suggests that people with disabilities are a minority group facing systemic prejudice, architectural exclusion, and societal discrimination.
Exactly. In the minority model, the core problem is not the individual's impairment. The problem is an environment designed exclusively for able-bodied neurotypical people.
Right. So if a building only has stairs,
The medical model says the person in the wheelchair is the problem because they cannot walk. But the minority model says the building is the problem because it lacks a ramp.
that shift in perspective changes everything.
It really does.
And there's this incredibly practical tool that comes from this model that you can actually use in your daily life.
Oh, yes. People first language.
People first language.
Yeah.
It is this deliberate restructuring of how we speak, and it has these profound psychological impacts.
It's essentially the shift from saying a disabled person to saying a person with a disability.
Right. Or instead of calling someone an autistic kid, you say a child with autism.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, words dictate our cognitive framing.
Yes.
When you use the phrase a disabled person, the adjective precedes the noun. You are making the disability their primary defining characteristic.
But by using people first language, you grammatically and conceptually place the humanity first.
Exactly. It emphasizes that this is a complete person with a career, a sense of humor, relationships, and aspirations who just happens to navigate a specific condition.
It strips away the label of being handicapped, and it restores agency.
It does.
And what is so vital about these modern counseling frameworks is that they provide actionable tools to actually give that agency back.
They do. There's a brilliant behavioral intervention used for students navigating ADD or ADHD.
Oh, right, encapsulated in the mnemonic slant.
Yes, SLANT is the perfect example of bridging the gap between a neurodivergent individual and a neurotypical environment.
Because instead of just handing a student a diagnosis and vaguely telling them to, pay attention,
Right, which doesn't work.
a counselor provides this mechanical framework.
So the steps are, well, S stands for sit up straight.
Okay.
L is lean forward.
So it's very physical.
Very physical. A is activate your thinking by asking questions. N is name key information. And T is track the teacher or speaker with your eyes.
To understand why this works, we really have to look at the cognitive science behind it.
Exactly. Because for a brain dealing with an attention deficit, executive function and focus require massive amounts of energy.
Right. So when a student physically sits up straight and leans forward, they are engaging their core muscles.
Which slightly increases blood flow and alertness.
And by actively tracking the speaker with their eyes, they are drastically reducing the peripheral visual stimuli that compete for their brain's attention.
SLANT basically turns the abstract concept of focus into a checklist of physical actions the student can actually control.
It empowers them. They aren't a broken student, they just need a different operating manual for the classroom.
Exactly.
Which kind of brings us to the professionals tasked with handing out these manuals. We've looked at the cycles of abuse, the neurological traps of addiction, and the societal barriers surrounding disability. So who is the person guiding clients through all this?
Well, rehabilitation counselors play a critical role here.
And what happens when their methodology fails?
To understand the full scope of their responsibility, we can examine this case study from the text of a counselor named George.
Right, George.
George ultimately failed his clients despite having genuinely good intentions.
Because George was a highly energetic rehabilitation counselor. On paper, his initial metrics were totally outstanding.
He was phenomenal at evaluating a client's skills and successfully placing them into competitive jobs or educational programs.
He was basically a master at getting people through the front door.
He was. But George operated on a really flawed assumption.
What was that?
He believed that once the placement was secured, his job was finished.
Oh.
He viewed follow-up as an inefficient use of his time. He just assumed the new environment would automatically sustain the client.
It's like George's approach is like a master gardener who spends weeks analyzing soil pH, carefully germinating a rare seed in a greenhouse, transferring it to a field, and then walking away, never to return.
That's a great analogy.
And then months later, he comes back, looks at a patch of dry dirt, and is genuinely baffled that a tree didn't grow.
Exactly. It completely ignores the reality of how living things adapt,
Because human integration is highly organic.
and often volatile. The frameworks outline 12 major functions of rehabilitation counseling, and ongoing evaluation and follow-up are absolutely central to it.
So when George abandoned his clients, he failed to account for the fact that a new job isn't a magical cure.
The new job introduces entirely new pressures.
Right. The client might face unanticipated physical barriers, social anxiety with new coworkers, or triggers that tempt to relapse into an addiction.
Precisely. And without an objective counselor there to help adjust the plan, mediate conflicts, and provide emotional support, the placement just becomes another overwhelming stressor.
So healing and integration are not just singular events you check off a to-do list.
No, they require relentless, supervised calibration.
You have to water the soil,
Yeah.
you have to adjust the stakes as the tree actually grows.
Exactly.
Well, we have covered a tremendous amount of ground today, exploring the invisible mechanics of human struggle.
You really have.
We looked at the predictable, trapping nature of the cycle of abuse, and why we have to pay attention to where it starts, even in childhood sibling dynamics.
Right.
We broke down the 3 C's of addiction, uncovering the neurological hijacking that drives both chemical dependency and those socially praised compulsions, like workaholism.
Yes.
We explored how the minority model and people-first language return dignity to those navigating disabilities. And finally, through George's oversight, we saw that genuine healing requires persistent, ongoing support.
It really provides a comprehensive lens for understanding not just how people break down, but the precise tools required to help them rebuild.
And for you listening, this knowledge isn't just academic, it is highly practical.
Very.
Because as you navigate your own life, your workplaces, and your families, you will encounter these hidden pressures. You might be the person who notices a subtle shift in a friend's behavior that hints at a cycle of abuse.
Right.
You might recognize that a colleague's relentless 80-hour work week is a cry for help rather than a bid for a promotion.
Exactly.
Or you might simply make the conscious choice to adopt people-first language in your daily conversations. Understanding these frameworks gives you the ability to look past the symptoms and see the human being underneath.
It makes you a more capable, empathetic participant in society. It really allows you to see the mechanisms driving the behavior.
It does.
And, looking at how our understanding of these mechanisms evolves, it raises a really important question for you to mull over.
Okay, what is it?
If our society currently normalizes and actively rewards a destructive process addiction like workaholism, what other daily socially praised behaviors are we engaging in right now that future counselors will have to treat as clinical addictions tomorrow?
Oh, wow. That is a fascinating thought to leave on. Are the habits we celebrate today just the next generation's diagnostic challenges?
Exactly.
We'll leave you to think about that. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the messy, complicated, and resilient nature of the human experience. Until next time, remember that human behavior is never as simple as a broken bone. It's a complex system, and it's up to us to learn how to read the dials.